So welcome everyone. Thank you so much for joining us today for our session on discovery and discomfort. Hopefully we will not be super uncomfortable in this session, but we hope we will help you to think about how to use discomfort productively. This is going to be an interactive session, and our goal is really to get you all into the work of thinking about how to create productive disagreement, productive dialogue in your classrooms while understanding that discomfort, as we heard this morning from Todd and Joe and Karen and David, is kind of part and parcel of the learning process. So today we are very thankful to have 3 guests here to speak with us and kind of start the conversation to generate some ideas that then you all can take into some exciting small group casework. We have Anthony Fox, who is the Emma Bloomberg Professor of the Practice of Leadership at the Kennedy School and Director of the Center for Public Leadership. Ned Hall, who is the Norman Vieumier, am I pronouncing that correctly?
Sure.
Okay, we'll go with that one. My high school French is possibly behind me here. Norman Vieumier, Professor of Philosophy at FAS and Director of Undergraduate Studies. And we have Rachel Viscomi, who is Clinical Professor of Law at Harvard Law School and Director of the Harvard Negotiation and Mediation Clinic. So today, like I said, we're going to start by learning from experience from our panelists and our speakers who will talk to us about their work and their strategies for creating civil discourse and productive disagreement in the classroom. Then we'll have you all apply some of these ideas by using some small cases that we have on your tables. We'll get to those in a bit. Then we'll do some shared learning, and then finally we'll leave lots of time for going deeper to give you all a chance to ask questions and really discuss what we talk about. But to begin, we want to turn to our panelists. One of the central ideas that we talked about during our prep for this session, and that we also heard a lot about during this morning's session, was that learning often involves discomfort. So in preparing, we talked about how each of you have kind of experienced discomfort with your students, but also discomfort as instructors, which I think all of us who have been teachers have experienced moments of that. But we've also talked about how you navigate discomfort in your practice, how you help students navigate it, and how you create classrooms, what principles you use to guide your kind of creation of the classroom space, and also what strategies you use to make the classroom space right for students really leaning into discomfort as individuals as well as a group. So for this short session, we wanted to give each of you about 5 minutes to talk to us about the principles that guide your approach to fostering open dialogue and productive disagreement, as well as examples of strategies that you've used that might be successful or perhaps less successful. So maybe, Anthony, if we could start with you.
Thanks, Erin, and it's great to be here with all of you. I consider us all sort of fellow travelers as we're trying to work our way through how we have these sort of uncomfortable conversations or constructive conversations over which students have sometimes profound disagreements. Let me start with maybe context setting. Last semester, I developed a course that I will teach again in another year after some refinement on bridging political divides. And the course was very deliberately focused on the subject of how bridges are built in the political realm. And so to some extent, the students self-selected themselves into the class, but we did have quite a bit of ideological diversity as well as other types of diversity in the class. The way that I thought about it going in was I kind of had 5 different sort of principles in mind. First, that the students themselves are hungry to discuss these very sensitive but important topics. Secondly, that the topics are inherently messy. Sounds like you all have had some of this discussion earlier. And establishing ground rules in the classroom is very important, things like the Chatham House rules and basic degrees of respect. Third, another principle that I brought to it was that my own experience was going to be important to how the students understood my own approach to the class. So I was very clear with them about my life experience growing up in the South, being sent to integrated schools through busing and various things that where I was in the eye of the hurricane myself, and it gave them sort of an anchor for who was in the middle of the classroom trying to teach them, which I thought was very important. Fourth, I talked to the students early on and very openly about what happens in a society where we don't engage on these issues. That's, I think, several degrees worse than if we do. And so, again, trying to prepare them for what was coming. And then finally, the texts that I chose in the class, in some ways, were my attempt to model what I was hoping the students would do, which was to develop some natural curiosity about people who think differently than they do. So I used David Brooks's How to Know a Person. I used Arthur Brooks's book, Love Your Enemies. Funny, I ran into Arthur at a faculty meeting, and I told him we were using his book. He said, "Well, you're one of 3 people who bought it." But nevertheless, it was a very useful activity. So I went through the course. I want to tell you some things that I thought worked well, and maybe some things that maybe didn't work so well, and then I'll pass it on to my other panelists here. I tried to use a reflective learning approach to the class. So we started the class with the students identifying someone with whom they had a profound disagreement in their own lives. So could have been a friend, could have been a parent, could have been whatever. And I would say that was by far the most successful project that I did. I asked them to write a letter to that person and to actually send the letter. And at the end of the class, some of the students shared what they got back. I had a father who had a estranged relationship with his son that was repaired as a result of that work. I had students who had a friend with whom they had a sharp ideological difference over the last election cycle, and they were able to find some place of common ground. So it was very personal, and I found that the personal aspects were very, very useful. I think where I am still doing some work and why I'm not teaching it this year is because everyone comes into a class like this at a different starting point. And in terms of evaluating progress, it's, very difficult to figure out what an A means or a B means or a C means in a class where you're really trying to promote personal growth and development and leadership. So I would say that's an area where I'd like to spend some time and learn a little more. Rachel.
So I was thinking about this. I want to preface this by saying everything I do that has worked well has also worked poorly. All dependent on the circumstances, the delivery, and other things. But I was thinking about this in sort of 3 different categories. What is preparatory or preventative in terms of structuring classroom conversation? What has to do with norms or level setting within the classroom? And then the third is kind of what happens when things are going off the rails in some way and you're trying to get them back on. So my quick couple minutes on that would be, in the preventative sense, one of the things that I do sometimes in the classroom is to very explicitly, if I'm worried that there are perspectives that are less likely to get airtime, is to assign perspectives and to be very clear that your own views are actually not what we're after in the first part of class, but that I want you to take the very best and, deepest, richest understanding you can of whatever the perspective is that you've been given. So I have students work in groups. If it's something where there's kind of, 2 sides, or 2 kind of primary things that we're looking at, I will have them not only think substantively about what they think the strongest arguments are, but also about how they think they can most effectively frame them. And then I will have them engaged with each other, and I just capture things on the board as quickly as I can, so that they feel like they are kind of engaged and they kind of get into it. And I find that usually once we've done that, then it's easier to move into, I usually do like sort of lift the restriction and say, okay, now we've kind of got a sense of the lay of the land, the terrain, thoughtful arguments, like A, has your view changed at all? And B, now like restrictions are off. What are your thoughts? What feels really hard about this? And so trying to get them to focus on those places that feel like at the interstices of what they think they know for sure, because usually that tends to be the most interesting discussion in my view. So second thing, in terms of norms, one of the visuals that I use that other folks may use is the, I learned it in a nonviolent peace force training, but I think I believe its genesis was in outward bound work. And it is a series of 3 concentric circles, right? The central circle is the comfort zone. The middle circle is the learning zone. The outward circle is the panic zone or the alarm zone. Depending on the class, I will sometimes just show that at the beginning of the class and say like, hey, if we just talk about things where you know exactly what you think, it'll be a light lift for you, but you're not going to walk out really having learned much. If we're talking about things that feel intense for you, where you feel like you're not open to engaging, you're also not going to learn a lot because you're going to be focused on defending yourself, right? And for each of us, our zones are going to look really different depending on what we're talking about. And so I will work to structure the conversation as best as I can to kind of keep us collectively in the learning zone. And for any individual one of us, we might find ourselves falling in a different place in a different moment. So I want to make sure that I'm very open to that feedback, and I'm open to thinking about what we can do in the classroom to try to maximize our ability to be growing as we work together. Sometimes I think that's helpful because it allows people to simply say, hey, it was actually hard for me to engage in that moment. Now that we've stepped back and we're in office hours, you know, I'm thinking about it a little bit more. To the everything that works sometimes doesn't work. I think sometimes if you do that in the first class, people are like, and I will be taking another class. From my perspective, though, that's also a feature. Because I would rather let people know what they're in for. Another thing I find really helpful, and again, it depends on the class, but one of the things I teach is a facilitation course where students are trying to lead challenging conversations. So I use a framework that is a build on Chris Argyris's work on Model 1 and Model 2. It's which focuses on, it's Roger Schwartz's elaboration, and the gist is sort of, there's the unilateral control model. And when I'm in that, often when I'm in the panic zone, right, I'm thinking about, I'm right, there's one right view, I have all the relevant information, I need to prove you wrong, versus the mutual learning model. So the notion that like, hey, I see some things based on where I sit and I miss other things. Everyone's got something to add that might be helpful, right? I got to get curious. And so just naming like, what do those mindsets look like? What do they show up as in terms of our behavior in a conversation, and what are the results we get so that we can explicitly sort of look for where those things might be showing up. And I will pause there and pass it along to Ned.
First, what Anthony and Rachel said. I'll add a couple things from my own experience, partly come from teaching a general education class in the college on argument and persuasion and disagreement, and partly from years of experience in different roles where uncomfortable conversations have arisen. So for me, one of the personal lessons that took me a long time to learn is that when things, for whatever reason, get uncomfortable, the thing to focus on or to target is not the discomfort, right? The mistake I've made repeatedly until I started to realize, oh, it was a mistake and there are other ways of going, is to think like, if there's discomfort, that is a problem to be solved. Maybe most simplistically, I need to do what I can right now to make it go away. And that's a mistake. Like the focus should not be on the discomfort. Discomfort is a signal. What it's a signal of, you can't necessarily tell without doing a lot more investigation, but that's where your attention should go. I will say in the classroom, it really helps a lot, or in other areas too. It helps a lot to just be very clear about what your sort of core values are that you're trying to manifest in whatever the interaction is. This could happen if you're a dean and you have students who come to you mad about something that a professor said in class. It could happen if you're in the class teaching and one student, there's a sort of chill descends over the class because someone said something that obviously got everyone's hackles up, et cetera. If you're clear about what your aims are, and what fundamental values those aims are in service of, that helps a lot in guiding you about what you should be targeting at the moments of discomfort. And it can help tons to do the kinds of things that Rachel and Anthony were saying about norm setting up front. So that's the more personal note. Took me a long time to learn, but don't target the discomfort. Target what it's a signal of. In my class, and now this is going to get much more into the weeds, I have found that I teach a lot of philosophy classes, of course, debate and argumentation are a central feature of philosophy. I found it's, while it can be useful to have students debate, like, here's a topic, abortion. You're going to take the pro-life side. You're going to take the pro-choice side. Let's go, and obviously give them some scaffolding and material to work with. I find that works way better if it comes rather late in the game. And certainly in the gen ed class that has a lot of students who are new to college, a very different way of getting them to focus on argumentation has been really powerfully effective. And that's to teach them the difference between using argumentation, carefully crafted, clear, logical links, as transparent as possible style argumentation, as a tool for communication rather than a tool for persuasion. So as an example, imagine you have two friends, Billy and Susie, and let's say they're both pro-choice. And Susie is well read on the pro-life literature. She knows what a lot of those people think. And Billy asks her one day, can you explain to me why they think what they do? There are two ways that Susie could engage that question. She could go on a rant about how sort of confused they are and the kinds of ideological distortions on the views of the pro-life people. Or she could say, oh yeah, I can explain. Here, let me lay out one of the main lines of reasoning as clearly as I can. And imagine that it's clear that what Billy wants is the second thing. He doesn't want a sort of mutual rant session. He's genuinely curious about what the structure is of this viewpoint that he profoundly disagrees with. Well, in answering his curiosity and satisfying his curiosity, Susie's going to lay out an argument, but not with the aim of persuading. And that makes all the difference to how she's engaging with the argument. It doesn't make sense to engage in rhetorical trickery. It doesn't make, to say disguise weak links in the argument. It doesn't make sense to use various techniques to try to get Billy on board with the premises of the argument, because that's irrelevant. It's not interesting to him. But, the question of whether he should believe the premises is not a live one. What he wants to see is how it all hangs together. And in the classroom, you can do this with students very early on. Even on very, very hot button topics. You can say, look, I'm going to teach you some techniques drawn from logic and argument mapping, and I'm going to have you engage with some really challenging texts that are maybe full of nasty rhetorical stuff, but also have genuine reasoning embedded within that. And your collective task is not to assess whether you agree. It's to distill out the reasoning so transparently and so charitably that you could satisfy a Billy who came along and said, I'm curious to understand how this worldview hangs together. And what that does is show students how to engage in a very intellectually serious, good faith way with a viewpoint they disagree with that takes their own emotional responses more or less off the table. Right? Because you're not asking them to fight with the view. You're just asking them to understand it. And that, I didn't think of, this I just sort of discovered that this worked by chance. But my favorite story to indicate how well it worked was a student who came back to me a year later and said that this technique had made all the difference in the world when she was arguing with her boyfriend, because she would step back and say, how would I map out his reasoning?
So thank you all so much. When my co-facilitators, Matthew and Hannah, and I were thinking about how we wanted this session to run, one of the things that we really wanted to do was make sure that people were actually thinking about how this applies in your own space. And then they sent us a list of everybody who registered, and we said, there's a lot of diversity in here. So we asked our panelists to help us come up with some cases, and that's what we're going to be working on for the next part of the session. On your table, you will see handouts that have 4 cases on them. Each one set in a slightly different place, touching on discomfort, discovery, and some aspect of learning, whether it's in the classroom, it's in office hours. There's a lot of different places where the learning process and discomfort happen. So we wanted to give you a chance to think about that. So for the next 10 minutes, we're going to have you work at your tables. On your table, you will see a very large sticky note. On the sticky note, you will see one of the cases written. That is your assigned case. So what we want you to do is look at your case, read through it, and then with your table, first nominate someone to actually take notes. There are pens there for you. But we want you to think about what the discomfort and the challenge that this scenario brings up. How would you, from your position and your perspective, foster open dialogue and productive disagreement in this space? And thinking about your work, your principles, but also what you've heard from Anthony, Rachel, and Ned, what principles would be guiding your approach to moving through and navigating this scenario for yourself, for your students, for your coworkers? How would you move this scenario forward? So 10 minutes in your groups, and then we'll come back and we'll share out.
All right, we're going to go around now in order of case study. So starting with case study 1 groups, and we would like to ask each table to share one principle and one strategy that you discussed. And this is quick. We want to get around the room in about 5 minutes so that we have time for Q&A at the end.
I think that one of the first things we do is we ask for the student for feedback on what could be different that would make them feel more comfortable. Also, either as the instructor or asking the student, the next time something comes up, ask the student, the next time something comes up you disagree with, ask a curious question about it. Don't rebut it. Role model the behavior you want to see your peers have.
Great.
I'll take the point number 1 and then have the rest of my team engage. So we talked a lot about 1, norms, and the second, not safe spaces, but brave spaces. The first one about norms, even if norms hadn't been established at the start, you can start again back at zero, ground zero, and reestablish norms. And part of it will be there are going to be different perspectives in the room, and engage, ask for clarification rather than just rebut. We don't know. We had a discussion about whether the rebuttals were disrespectful or respectful. We don't know that from the case scenario. The second thing about, you want to?
I can say just in terms of the norms part. So I do a lot of facilitations at Harvard. One of the norms that I put in place is to prioritize alignment over agreement. So alignment now, we're here to talk about, how do we navigate discomfort or discovering discomfort or what so have you. That's our alignment. We're all here to do the same thing. Agreement is that we're going to leave this room and we're all going to agree on how to do it. And normally people go into conversations and they prioritize agreement. And if they leave and there's no agreement, they feel like they haven't accomplished anything. But the goal is not agreement, the goal is alignment.
Great, thank you.
So we are case 2, and the short summary is that there are 2 students two women in a class who feel that they're, like a professor is playing favorites toward the other men in the class, and come to you as the director of undergraduate studies. And our single principle that we're taking off of our list is direct communication and agency. And what goes hand in hand with that is our chosen practice, which is to equip and coach people and empower them to have those conversations that they need to have.
We're all kind of staring at each other. We also had case 2. We had similar principles. We talked about the overarching one we agreed with was the don't treat the uncomfortable, but get to the root. And I think in the beginning, talking with the female students, sometimes as the administrator, probably saying less and just opening the space for them to clarify, because there are a lot of statements in the case that assumptions could be made. And we all know what happens when you assume. And I think focusing on like what is the perception that the students have, and just giving them that time to understand their perspective and not trying to think about how do I remediate the situation where two students are uncomfortable and thinking I need to solve. I think this is kind of like the bait of that case.
Can you tell them what case are you?
Okay, so we're case 3. The dean has been approached by a group of students who find a recent published article by a potential future professor of theirs to be abhorrent, and they want them gone, and they certainly don't want to be taught by them. So we were talking about approaching with curiosity and validating the students' concerns, but at the same time trying to shift from their belief or possible belief that they're trying to persuade you that their opinion is the one to take action on, and to try and move them into a communication space where they're learning about what environment they're in and academic freedoms and how to have difficult conversations and how to interact with people whose opinions that they do not agree with. And we found it really hard to solve this problem in 10 minutes. But there was the feeling heard and feeling that action is to be taken is something to kind of struggle between, because how you react as the dean in this moment could go terribly or could help them grow as people. And it's that margin of knowing when to do it.
To articulate.
Great, thank you. Do we have?
Oh, yes. And helping to articulate their position in a way that's positive for them and for the environment as a whole.
Thank you so much. Do we have another case 3?
Yep.
Let's go there then.
Okay, so we were also case 3. We actually got caught up in the details a lot on this, which sounds like an excuse for dilly-dallying, but I do think it's kind of relevant, right? Because we were really taking the student's perspective seriously and wanted to know things like, is this article on something that would be taught in the class, or is it completely irrelevant to that? Is this article in a published peer-reviewed journal, or is this in a, like, rag for a particular political viewpoint? Like, there are a lot of questions that sort of impact how we might think about this. But we did think that like all of these point towards taking the students seriously, but opening up the conversation for here are the contours of academic engagement. Like this is how the academic enterprise works. We talked a little bit about how even our most bright students don't necessarily understand descriptive versus normative comments sometimes, and they conflate these things because their experience with argument. And we are all from the college, basically. I'm sorry. So like we're thinking a lot about this in an undergraduate way, admittedly, but I think even by grad school, we don't have any guarantee that anybody's taken Ned's class, sadly. So we don't know that they have all of these kinds of understandings of these particular ways of engaging with academic argument. So there's a lot of learning opportunity for the student just about what it means to participate in the enterprise that I think would be the we talked about as the sort of foundational part. Did I skip anything?
Great, and let's move to case 4.
Yeah, let's move to case 4. Okay, we were case 4, and case 4 was discussing difficult and complex issues in class and how to get others engaged if there is one point that's always being discussed. We really talked about strategies of the facilitator itself, about fishing for opposing views, but also being able to identify who those squeaky wheels are, the one who speaks up the most and trying to engage others. And then our group also talked about strategies, specific strategies of some that were shared from the panelists about assigning alternative perspectives, and we talked about those and the execution of what that might be, avoiding binary, and having more than just two choices so that people can think of more than just two sides, participation points for bravery, and flipped classroom styles as well. Our group also spent a lot of time thinking just about the perspective of the classroom, of what is the chilling effect due to confidence, or is it the topic itself? So we spent more of the time talking about that. Okay.
We've been discussing something very similar. That is, if there is a consensus in a class, don't believe it, and try to explore who is not agreeing, but just afraid of saying it. And don't place yourself in the position of devil's advocate. Just find someone who can play this role. Yeah.
Thank you so much. So at the end, we will come around and attach these your notes to the wall. So if anyone wants to stick around afterwards into lunch and look at what people wrote, they will be on the wall at the end. But for now, we want to give you a good 10 minutes to ask whatever questions you have on your mind to our panelists. And we will come around with mics. Yes.
Perfect. Rachel, I had a question for you. So one of the things that you said, and it might be the dynamic of you being at the law school, I believe. So one of the things that you said is that when after students are engaging, you ask them this question, did your mind change or something? So in the facilitations I do, I tell people in advance, after doing the community guidelines or norms, I say the goal here is for me not to change your mind, but to help you explore why you're so resistant to your mind being changed. And so I'm wondering if navigating the discomfort is harder when the goal you have is changing minds.
So the goal is definitely not changing minds.
Okay.
So thanks for adding that. Yeah. The question is, did you learn something? Did your view shift at all? But where? At the interstices. The goal is certainly not for people to change their minds. In fact, when we were chatting amongst ourselves, we were talking about the ways in which often having your mind change is actually both unhelpful and maybe not. It goes maybe to what you were saying around alignment and moving forward. I think, however, it is really important for people to be willing to explore different perspectives and to think about, okay, these are the things I'm really sure about. Where are the places I'm on the fence? Where are the arguments that people made that really added to or enriched my understanding of this issue? Because what I'm looking for is for us to get to a place that is more complex. And I think especially at the law school, where advocacy is what students kind of come in expecting to do, and their goal is like, how do I destroy the other person's argument? I'm wanting them to really think about just adding in nuance, having a more complex understanding of where the trade-offs are, and appreciating that in a lot of our classes, you're making choices and choices have consequences. You may prefer this set to that set, and you want to be able to think through those things. So the thing that we do from like a visual perspective is to build out the argument structure. So where we might use like Barry Johnson's polarities framework, for example, and put out like, okay, what are the benefits of thinking about it in this way? What are the upsides of this approach? What are the upsides of that approach? What are the downsides? What happens if we have an excess of this approach or an excess of that approach? Usually, if people are super committed, this goes to your point about what's hard for you about changing your view or engaging another view. Usually, we're really stuck on the diagonal where I can see the benefits of this approach and the downsides of this approach, and I think that's all there is. But the risk, of course, is that anything, if it's a real polarity, right? If it's something that exists in an interdependent relationship with something else, my inability to see the perils of overuse of the approach that I am advocating is a real weakness in my ability to think complexly about the question that I'm engaging. Thanks for the question.
Thank you.
I'm interested to hear a little bit more about emotions. I thought it was interesting, Ned, when you said when you do the mapping, that's a way to take emotions out of it. And I can see how that's beneficial. I can also see that how emotions are an integral part of the humanness of the dialoguing across difference. And it's also a part of what makes this really hard. And in a lot of these scenarios, what made us all, I mean, at least me, tight about wanting to respect everyone's feelings and reactions. So I just love to hear a little bit more about how you think about dealing with emotions in the classroom, and is it mostly less is better, or to do it well?
Yeah, it's a super complex question. When I started teaching this class, I realized I was working with a mental model that, look, if you want to just dispassionately, if you want to argue well, emotion should be entirely out of it. And over time, I came to think that was painfully, not just naive, but kind of wrong-headed. Sometimes persuasive argumentation properly draws on emotional responses. Sometimes I think of emotions as properly used as they are to value what our sense perceptions are to the physical world around us. No, not always, right? But I think what I try to communicate to my students is you want to know how to bracket your emotional response, so that you want to be able to do that, so that you can then exercise judgment about when it's appropriate to do so and when it's not. That's kind of a quick answer. But certainly in the early parts of the course, where we're just building up tools, a lot of the emphasis is on let's practice dissect, extracting out the line of reasoning from this really obnoxious argument, precisely so you can see what it's like to disengage in emotions. Not because that's always what you want to do, but if you have no practice at it, then you can't. You've sort of lost a certain kind of freedom of freedom of engagement with persuasion, if that makes sense. Either of you want to?
Yes, thank you. I think we have one more at that table, and then over here.
That's a really great tee up for my question. I'm not sure if it's the same question or a different question. There's a higher ed desire to take emotion off the table and think about logic and reasoning and knowledge. And in addition to the humanness of the emotional portion of these conversations, sometimes I've discovered that topics and viewpoints, people often do make their cases based on emotional or societal or history or identity. And so it's not just about the emotions that we bring to these conversations, but sometimes acknowledging the fact that people's viewpoints or their statements at their core are based on an emotional foundation. And so, I guess it's a question about how do we facilitate, how do we be part of conversations where we're both managing our own emotional responses to things, but also taking into consideration the fact that maybe that is part of what we're discussing as well.
Yeah.
Is that a question? I don't know.
Well, I'll try and then welcome other thoughts. But I think what we're collectively unpacking here is the possibility the classroom can be a place to have students working towards rationalizing, not rationalizing, but thinking with their rational brains about issues from a different point of view, and sort of doing it in, for lack of a better word, more clinical way, and separating their emotions from what they are processing. I think there's also the possibility that students can investigate where their emotions are coming from. And I think that is powerfully important. Now, my experience has been that I'm able to do that more effectively in office hours as I'm talking to students, and they're expressing to me, how they feel so strongly about a particular issue. And there are a lot of why questions that come back at them. And, it's hard for people who have perhaps learned to think that their entire position on an issue is coming from a place of study and rigor, but there's an element of emotion that's come into it that they're not necessarily aware of. But I've been successful in office hours in being able to unpack that. So I would strongly encourage, the use of office hours to get more direct engagement with students on this. When it comes up in the classroom, my experience has been if you've prepared the classroom well enough to investigate these sorts of things, sometimes I can take it off of the student and say, I have an experience that's very similar to that, and I have a very strong feeling about X issue, and this is where it comes from. Is that similar to your experience? And then give them a window into explaining further. So I think there's all sorts of ways to take that emotion and try to find a place for it in the classroom and beyond it.
Actually, still on the thread of emotion, I wanted to ask about discomfort and kind of cognitive load. And how do you, we know that having a classroom conversation where there is a lot of discomfort is productive and increases cognitive load, and that in many cases that load might be unevenly distributed based on how people's identity and the topic connects. So I'm just curious, for each of you, how do you navigate that, both in sort of setting norms and maybe outs for people in conversations, and then also just as you're facilitating?
So my question was a little bit about out of the classroom. So it's really, one is you talked about your courses are self-selecting, right? They come a little bit with the mindset of that. And when we were talking about our controversial scholarship, which was really interesting, was it's out of the, we're first well, what's the scope, right? Is it just a group of students, or is this going to turn nuclear? And so how do you address it when you can't, easier in degree, set that framework where you're we're all here to talk about something and we're profoundly going to disagree, where it's, it becomes a little more mob than individual.
Right. So a brief stab at these complex questions.
Well, yeah, I mean, in some ways, I think the last question is also about emotion, right? And I would say because I do clinical work in addition to classroom work, and because one of the things we do is teach people to lead conversations, we hit emotions pretty directly. And so we try to give, if you're interviewing someone about their experience and they're giving you a really emotional response and you kind of scooch down to your next interview question, that's going to have a substantive impact on what you're learning. And when you are kind of getting the mob mentality going, that often has a lot to do with emotions. And so we do teach students both how to engage it in others and how to engage it with yourselves. One of the things I find super helpful in that front, and that I assign in my multi-party negotiation class that I teach with a colleague around the internal multi-party negotiation, is Robert Schwartz's IFS framework. Which helps them, I think, break down a little bit what's going on for them, what's happening in the room. And I'm sorry, I just called Dick Schwartz, whose name is actually Richard Robert, but such are the things that happen in the moments when you're talking extemporaneously. So I think in terms of classroom conversation and the cognitive load, just really, and even in clinical work, thinking about what's likely to come up in this interview. Have we talked in advance about what's going to be tricky for different people? Have we identified for ourselves where we think we're more likely to hit our panic zones? And can we proactively engage that and engage it as it comes up? I mean, it's a little more of an art than a science, but I think those are all things that require tracking. Yeah.
I'll do super quickly on how to handle cognitive load in the classroom. I definitely don't know a full answer to that, but one of the benefits, if you're the instructor, is you get to script the class a bit. And I find it really helpful to sort of be thinking about the ebb and flow of the class and make sure that there are places where we're easing back, not maybe on the emotional cognitive load, like in the class I mentioned, we often start each class just with a logic puzzle. And the students love the logic puzzles. By the way, logic is the most deeply humanistic discipline there is. But I think it's important as an instructor also just to be able to adjust on the fly. And if you're in the middle of a conversation that's clearly this, you can tell the students are feeling taxed, say, you know what, let's just all take a break. Because you're also signaling to them that you get it. You're not just in the mode of get your emotions under control. All right. But you're more expressing a bit of compassion to them about what they're experiencing.
Let's do some quick takeaways. Panels like these are always so generative, and then we're running out the door. So we really just want to give you a moment. We have some of the sticky notes already up here. We're going to put the other ones up in a second. But while we're doing that, you can take out your cell phone, point it at one of these screens, and just take a minute to think, what's a really concrete takeaway that you want to apply in your specific work with students or instructors or colleagues. What's useful about this is, one, gives you a moment to think what's helpful for you. And also you can use this same page to see what other folks' takeaways are. So you can, read this later after lunch or whenever, after folks have entered theirs, and really get some concrete takeaways that may inspire you further. So we've heard so much today. I know one thing I'm going to take is just the real value of transparency, thinking it through myself and making it clear to the people I'm working with, in my case, in my classrooms with my students. Why are we doing it this way? What are the benefits of what we're doing when we're discussing together? Join me in giving our panelists a thank you round of applause.